Welcome to this mini-series where we'll be exploring survey research more in details. In this session, we understand the purpose and the use of survey. We'll try to understand the process of conducting survey research, and we'll be aware of the advantages and limitations of survey research. First of all, what is survey research? Survey research is used to quantitatively describe specific aspects of a given population. These aspects often involve examining the relationships among variables. Survey research uses a selected portion of the population from which the findings can later be generalized back to the population. In survey research, independent and dependent variables are used to define the scope of study, but cannot be explicitly controlled by the researcher. Before conducting the survey, the researcher must predicate a model that identifies the expected relationships among the variables. The survey is then constructed to test this model against observations of the phenomena. The term survey instrument is often used to distinguish the survey tool from the survey research that it is designed to support. Survey methodology is the study of survey methods. As a field of applied statistics concentrating on human research surveys, survey methodology studies the sampling of individual units from a population and associated techniques of survey data collection, such as questionnaire construction and methods for improving the number and accuracy of responses to surveys. Survey methodology targets instruments or procedures that ask one or more questions that may or may not be answered. Researchers carry out statistical surveys with a view towards making statistical inferences about the population being studied. Such inferences depend strongly on the survey questions used. Surveys provide important information for all kinds of public information and research fields, such as marketing research, psychology, healthcare provision, and sociology too. A single survey is made of at least a sample, a method of data collection, usually a questionnaire, and individual questions or items that become data that can be analyzed statistically. A single survey may focus on different types of topics, such as preferences, opinions, behavior, or factual information, depending on its purpose. Since survey research is almost always based on a sample of the population, the success of the research is dependent on the representativeness of the sample with respect to a target population of interest to the researcher. The target population can range from the general population of a given country to specific groups of people within that country, to a membership list of a professional organization, or list of students enrolled in a school system. The persons replying to a survey are called respondents, and depending on the questions asked, their answers may represent themselves as individuals, their households, employers, or other organizations they represent. The survey design involves different steps. First, a sampling plan must be developed. The sampling plan is the methodology that will be used to select the sample from the population. The sampling plan describes the approach that will be used to select the sample, how an adequate sample size will be determined, and the choice of media through which the survey will be administered. Survey media include telephone and face-to-face interviews, as well as mailed surveys using either postal or electronic mail. Then, procedures for obtaining population estimates from the sample data and for estimating the reliability of those population estimates must be established. This process includes identification of the desired response rate and the preferred level of accuracy for the survey. Survey design procedures require inputs from the people who will use the survey data and from those who will conduct the survey. The data users should identify the variables to be measured, the estimates required, the reliability and validity needed to ensure the usefulness of the estimates. And the last phase of the survey process is the execution or use of the survey instrument. The choice of survey media is determined by the resources that are available. Let's focus first on written surveys. Written surveys require minimum resources, like staff, time, and cost, and are best suited for confidential information. Minimal sampling error occurs due to the relatively low cost per survey. There are also minimal interviewer and respondent measurement errors due to the absence of direct contact. Written surveys may be distributed using either postal or electronic mail. In some cases, written surveys are distributed in person to a group of respondents to evaluate a recent event. Among the disadvantages of written surveys are their subjectivity to certain types of error. For example, written surveys are subject to coverage error where population lists are incomplete or out of date. They are also typically subject to no-response error. Less educated, illiterate, or disabled people are particularly less likely to respond to written surveys. Written surveys are also subject to bias where the intended respondent refers to others in completing the survey. And finally, written surveys are subject to item no response, where some questions may be intentionally or unintentionally skipped. Verbal surveys. Verbal surveys include telephone and face-to-face interviews. The face-to-face interview is a particularly flexible tool that can capture verbal gestures and other body language. A skilled interviewer can obtain additional insights into the answers provided by observing the respondent's body language. Face-to-face interviews are useful where the true population is not known or when respondents are unable or unlikely to respond to written surveys. They are also well suited to long or complex questionnaires and for reaching the correct respondent. Verbal surveys are, however, subject to measurement error, when untrained interviewers are used. They are also resource intensive in terms of staff, facilities, and time. Findings from face-to-face interviews in particular are difficult to summarize and incorporate in data analysis. And lastly, we have the mixed mode surveys, where there is a combination of survey media. This approach first uses the best method for achieving a high response rate at the lowest possible cost. Other media are then used to improve the response rate at increasing costs per survey. Written surveys are usually the first method used in mixed mode surveys, followed by verbal survey methods. The most important methodological challenges of a survey methodologist include making decisions on how to identify and select potential sample members, contact sampled individuals and collect data from those who are hard to reach or reluctant to respond. Evaluate and test the questions. Select the mode for posing questions and collecting responses. Train and supervise interviewers if they are involved, of course. Check data files for accuracy and internal consistency. Adjust survey estimates to correct for identified errors. There are several ways of administering a survey. The choice between administration modes is influenced by several factors, including the cost, coverage of the target population, flexibility of asking questions, respondents' willingness to participate, and response accuracy. There are several different designs or overall structures that can be used in survey research. The three general types are cross-sectional, successive independent samples, and longitudinal studies. Let's start with cross-sectional studies. In cross-sectional studies, a sample is drawn from the relevant population and studied once. A cross-sectional study describes characteristics of that population at one time, but cannot give any insight as to the causes of population characteristics because it is a predictive correlational design. Successive independent studies are instead designed to draw multiple random samples from a population at one or more times. This design can study changes within a population, but not changes within individuals, because the same individuals are not surveyed more than once. Such studies cannot, therefore, identify the causes of change over time. For successive independent samples designs to be effective, the samples must be drawn from the same population and must be equally representative of it. If the samples are not comparable, the changes between samples may be due to demographic characteristics rather than time. In addition, the questions must be asked in the same way so that responses can be compared directly. And finally, longitudinal studies take measure of the same random sample at multiple time points. Unlike with a successive independent samples design, this design measures the differences in individual participants' responses over time. This means that a researcher can potentially assess the reasons for the response changes by assessing the differences in respondents' experiences. Longitudinal studies are the easiest way to assess the effect of a naturally occurring event, such as divorce, that cannot be tested experimentally. However, longitudinal studies are both expensive and difficult to do. It is harder to find a sample that will commit to a month or year-long study instead of just 15-minute interview, and participants frequently leave the study before the final assessment. Such studies sometimes require data collection to be confidential or anonymous, which creates additional difficulty in linking participants' responses over time. One potential solution is the use of a self-generated identification code. These codes usually are created from elements like month of birth and first letter of the mother's middle name. In addition, the overall attrition of participants is not random, so samples can become less representative with successive assessments. To account for this, a researcher can compare the respondents who left the survey to those that did not, to see if they are statistically different populations. Respondents may also try to be self-consistent in spite of changes to survey answers. Questionnaires are the most commonly used tool in survey research. However, the results of a particular survey are worthless if the questionnaire is written inadequately. Questionnaires should produce valid and reliable demographic variable measures and should yield valid and reliable individual disparities that self-report scales generate. A pilot survey must first be conducted to test both the instrument and the survey procedures before the actual survey is conducted. Surveys can be evaluated in two ways. First, survey questions can be evaluated using focus group discussions, cognitive interviews to determine how well respondents understand the questions and how they formulate the responses, and pilot tests of surveys under field conditions. Second, responses to surveys can be analyzed to reveal expected relationships among the answers given and to ensure consistency of respondent characteristics across questions. Responses can be compared to alternatively worded questions and to official records when available. Surveys can also be evaluated by measuring the consistency of responses to given questions over time. Finally, we can identify some strengths and weaknesses in survey methodology. Let's start with the strength. Surveys are capable of obtaining information from large samples of the population. They are also well suited to gathering demographic data that describe the composition of the sample. Surveys are inclusive in the types and number of variables that can be studied, require minimal investment to develop and administer, and are relatively easy for making generalizations. Surveys can also elicit information about attitudes that are otherwise difficult to measure using observational techniques. It is also important to note that surveys only provide estimates for the true population, not exact measurements. Now let's focus on some weaknesses. Now, surveys are generally unsuitable where an understanding of the historical context of phenomena is required. Therefore, biases may occur either in the lack of response from intended participants or in the nature and accuracy of the responses that are received. Other sources of error include intentional misreporting of behaviors by respondents to confound the survey results or to hide inappropriate behavior. And finally, respondents may have difficulty assessing their own behavior or have poor recall of the circumstances surrounding their behavior. And this is the end of our session. I hope you enjoyed learning a bit more on survey methods, and I look forward to meeting you all very soon. Goodbye.